Noah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
No worries. So, you study ancient and modern history at the University of Oxford, and I was doing a bit of research just before we kick things off on what does ancient and modern history actually entail. And I was quite shocked to realize that it covers a span of 5,000 years, more or less, from the ancient Greeks to the ancient Romans to the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and obviously modern day. So, could you describe a little bit on what you actually do and how someone like you as a student manages to spend their time across 5,000 years during a 3 year degree?
Yeah, well, I have quite a lot of gripe with the name. For me, it should just be called history. Everyone else does modern history, but yeah, I think kind of thinking of it as something special or distinct kind of takes away from the discipline. I think the main thing to underline about it and the way that we managed to fit so much into 3 years is that you get so much choice. You get to focus on whatever period you want, and that can also vary. So I have a huge love for classical Athens. I find it super interesting, and I'm going to write my thesis on it. So I've done a few modules that kind of look at Athens in the period, kind of context before it, the Persians as well, kind of get a sense of that. But then I also really, really love Italy, and you mentioned it, I also love Renaissance Florence. So next term, my special subject, which is kind of one of the ones where you get to specialise the most, is on that. And previously, I've done a few medieval papers that look in kind of broader detail around them. So I think the main thing and the main reason that I love the particular degree that I've chosen is just how much choice you get, and you never really have to do something you don't like, which is quite nice to get a
Yeah.
good degree at the end of too.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great things about Oxford and Cambridge is because they really do prioritize intellectual flexibility and they will never pigeonhole you into a very specific time period of history, geography, politics, whatever it is that you're studying, which is obviously fantastic. But I'm quite curious, what is it that draws you to ancient history? I'm really keen to know, like, what is it in particular about that period of time that gets you excited, and ultimately, what made you apply for the subject at university as well?
I think for me, it's kind of, as you just mentioned, the intellectual flexibility that comes with it. One of the things that I like about not having many sources for the period is that you end up being able to make almost any argument you want, and you kind of really get to test the skill in formulating that. In more modern history, it can sometimes feel like there's an agreed upon answer to things, and I think history as a discipline is very good at making you question those things that you take for granted. But I find that ancient history in particular, because you are trying to recreate the experience of women with four mentions of them in the entire period, kind of thing, that it really lets you bring out your creativity. And I also kind of like the sense of perspective you get, where it can feel that a lot of history, and like I mentioned before, Renaissance Florence, and I'm going to say this, and I'm not sure how many people would, was actually only 600 years ago, and that it feels very close to our period. It's kind of still in Europe. A lot of history is written from that perspective, and so you don't necessarily get a distinct point of view. But when you're looking at something that's so old, it's kind of inevitable that you see things in a new perspective, and lets you kind of challenge your ideas. And that's kind of what I wanted to do at university. I don't really like the idea of doing the same thing from the same perspective, but instead trying to test out different perspectives and figure out how I kind of actually understand the world around me.
Hmm. And I guess having spent, the best part of 1.5 years burying your head in texts around, the ancient times, I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts on how similar was ancient times to today, or how dissimilar was it? Because obviously it's such a foreign concept to anyone to imaginatively picture what an ancient civilization might look like. And when we see snippets of it on TV, in books, in poetry, all those sorts of things. But when you're actually studying it and you're studying the people, the processes, the places, you must get a real tangible sense of what it was like to be a living person back then. Would you say it was the human experience was similar, or are we, exponentially different to today?
I would say that I think we're very similar in the way that we function, but that the kind of inputs, if you will, that people had access to, their environment, the kind of the cultural norms, the wealth inequality as well, the democratic systems, these all varied so drastically that the result of humanity was quite different, but the kind of the way they arrived there is quite similar. And I think that kind of talking before about how few sources there are and how much you kind of have to extrapolate from them, one of the things that I think is very valuable to rely on is the human condition, kind of what is reasonable for a human to act in that situation, and that you can get quite far looking at that. And so, yeah, I would say that definitely their day-to-day lives hugely differed, and was kind of very drastically different. But in terms of the way that people responded to things, and I mean, especially I have a big care for social history, and if you look at people's interrelationships, they're very similar. People are fundamentally very social human beings, and there are things that they think are important to govern and things that they are more flexible in. And I think these attitudes express themselves throughout time, even if the way they express themselves is different.
Yeah. Now that's interesting perspective. What do you think was the reason why, humans weren't able to progress as much as they could back then in ancient times? I mean, this might be a very naive perspective from me as a non-historian, but I'd imagine that the technologies available to them back then were very similar to what is available to us now. And so, what do you think were the factors that, meant that growth was often so much slower in the past? And in the last 100 years, we've seen this bell curve of pretty much everything, of political developments, of economic progress, of technological progress in particular, really ever since the sort of early 20th century. So what held people back then? It might be a silly question, but keen to hear your thoughts.
No, I don't think it's a silly question at all. For me, I think that it's as simple as people not necessarily desiring the growth, that people were actually quite content with the way that things were, and so there wasn't really a need to push things any further. If you're able to provide enough food for your family, if you're able to enjoy what you consider to be a pleasant life, and that's all you really need at the end of the day. And so I think as communication spreads so much, and kind of the much more modern period, people start innately kind of comparing themselves more, and I think with comparison comes competition. And so then there's always the desire to, now whether it's have the next model of iPhone or, make slightly more money than the people around them. Whereas if instead you're just living in your village and everyone's getting on and is friendly, then you don't really need to be doing anything more. So there's less of an incentive to grow. And you still see people develop, democratic ideals, mathematical ideals, but this is amongst a very small elite group where there is a lot of communication and subsequently competition. So I think it is just as simple as that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and it cast my mind back to my second year of geography. We did a module on development economics, and one of the central focuses of that module was, what does it mean to live a good life? And I remember one of the lecturers made a very convincing argument that actually, in some real way, around 100 to 200 years ago, before technology and this communication architecture really exploded, it was probably much easier to live a happier, simpler life, because, as the old saying goes, comparison is the thief of joy. And when you can start seeing the progress that the world is sort of engaging in, what's happening around the world, it almost elicits something in you. It brings something in you to start improving yourself, to start climbing the Maslowian hierarchy of needs, from basic subsistence right through to sort of self-actualization. And so, yeah, it got me thinking about how maybe being sort of a subsistent farmer working in agriculture 200-300 years ago was conducive to a much better state of mind. And it's almost unsurprising that with the growth of technology and communication has come a whole range of, psychological problems and mental health problems, because it's not normal to be able to see every single person in the world at the same time doing something different to you. And I guess it's a side point, but that's one of the reasons why I try and really limit my use of social media, because I just don't think we're engineered psychologically to see everything that's going on in the world. It can almost drive you insane. But that's a separate point to history. So yeah, I think that's quite an interesting perspective. The whole idea of communication and seeing the world as it is. I actually wanted to ask you an interesting question on history itself. Now, I don't know if this is the correct way of phrasing it, but some people might argue that history is in the past. What's the point in studying it? What's done is done. What argument would you lay out to someone? And for example, we might have clearly we'll have a lot of people applying to Oxbridge listening to this podcast, and many of them will be preparing for a classic interview question, which is something along the lines of why bother studying history in the first place? Why can we learn from the past? So what would your perspective on that be, given that you've had a couple of years now at Oxford and you've obviously been through the whole process and read so much stuff? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think my most kind of basic answer to all these what's the point of history, why study history, the answer I always give is just because I really love it. It's because I want to at the end of the day. I think for me, I kind of touched upon a slightly deeper answer perhaps earlier, in terms of I think it helps me understand how I see the world. I think I almost kind of feel that you get a lot of, very geography here, a lot of case studies that you get to examine the way that people function within them, the way that the environment functions within them, all these different layers of it, and that using those skills you can then apply them to the real world. So I would agree that there's not a burning need for humanity to understand the particular art styles of Renaissance Florence and how they contributed to political conflict. But I would argue that the skills that one develops there, looking at the way that images are constructed, the way that people express themselves through ideas, the way that individuals' ideas affect politics and the kind of political debates surrounding that, I think that is important, right? And so I think that you kind of get these extemporal skills and ability to understand things in a way that I don't think you can get from just looking at the modern world, because you don't know which bits of it are special and which bits repeat themselves, right? Like I was saying before about how humans act, or I think humans act similarly in similar situations. You don't know kind of in which ways they act. And I think another thing that I find fascinating, especially looking at, as you said, such a wide span of history, is thinking about which bits are different, which bits in our society aren't just kind of necessary states of nature handed down to us, but are instead things that we have control over and can change. And I think the thing that you end up learning by looking at such a wide range of history is that you can do that to everything. Everything is changeable, and I think that, for me at least, was a very important lesson to learn, and that you don't have to kind of accept the state of things, but can work to make them align with your ideals.
Yeah, I really like that last point. I guess it really speaks to this whole notion of an inner locus of control. Do things happen to you, or do you can take control of your life and steer the boat in the right direction? And I think in a similar way, there's a read across there with history, because I'm sure as a historian, you might look at something like World War II, and it's so obvious in retrospect that all of the events that led up to the Great War could have been avoided through a very simple decision that someone could have made at 9 p.m. on a Wednesday. I'm sure that's a huge oversimplification, but that whole sort of notion of chaos theory is quite interesting, how one tiny decision can have huge ramifications on the entire course of history. And it's always been like a fascinating sort of thought experiment of mine. Like, what would you do if you could go back in time in 1911? Would you go and tell someone that actually it's probably better if you don't go to a certain country at this time, because then you'll prevent yourself from getting into that war, or whatever? It's like quite a fascinating read of history. I actually wanted to pick up on something you mentioned earlier. And, you were sort of discussing on how you obviously have various different sources, lots of different arenas to explore within history, whether that's books, newspapers, things buried deep in the ground, whatever it is that historians use. How do you actually determine what is a useful piece of information? Because I'm thinking about this in the context of modern history and our news, because most of the stuff that you hear in the news, i.e., reported journalism, will largely be rendered as noise in 10 years' time. It doesn't last. If you pick up the BBC newspaper today, well, it'll be the mobile app, it's likely that the article you read will be irrelevant in 10 days' time. And so, how do you know that just because something has survived history, that it is relevant and important, if you understand my point?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first point, and kind of what we've mentioned previously, is the sheer volume of communication. So one of the reasons that today so many articles are irrelevant in 10 days is because there will have been 9 more articles on that topic at that point, where that's not necessarily and is very rarely the case. I can't really think of anything that would be that common, at least in ancient history. But I think another thing, and perhaps the most important reason, is that for something to have survived that long, unless it's kind of an archaeological remnant that, it was just time was kind to it and it was in the right environment to survive, there's been a chain of people since it was created that have decided that it's important. And that's kind of important in itself, right? So we don't have a lot of kind of Plato or Plutarch or Herodotus. We don't have their original manuscripts, but we have manuscripts that have been copied out and annotated, and then someone else has copied it out, and it's been passed along and along, and you have hundreds of years of old copies that you can then track. So I think one of the ways that you decide what's important is by looking at what was important to other people in history. And that doesn't necessarily mean that every source is important at face value, but that there are layers to that source that you can kind of pull back and figure out what is the important information that you can extract. But yeah, so I think a source, for it to be important, it has to properly speak to people, right? There's a lot of sources that we have nowadays, such as you mentioned, the news, that are just kind of created and they are presented. That doesn't necessarily mean they hold a special place, but it just means that they are available. Whereas in the past, most sources that were created for a more specific audience, and that audience would be receiving to it. And so therefore it holds importance because it is linked to the society that it comes from, rather than merely being a product that's kind of mass created and pushed out.
Yeah, I think it's a really important idea, and there's a real read across to modern day times. So, I mean, a few weeks ago, I came across a really great term called the Lindy effect. I think it pretty much summarizes that the longer something has been around, the more likely it will persist into the future. And so that's why we have the Bible or these great works of fiction. People have passed them on and they've repurposed them. And so, really, if we are to educate ourselves, if we're to extract information from the vast sources that are out there, we should really be focusing on the ones that have survived. Because if we focus on the most flashy, or the ones that look the most interesting to us, or the ones that are presented in the most elaborate, illustrious way, there's a real risk that the actual quality of that information is quite poor. And so I know it's a tangential point, but this is one of the other reasons why I've moved away from social media, because our news cycle is so it's highly recurrent. It's very now, and largely it will be irrelevant and redundant in 10 days' time. So I choose to spend more of my time focusing on material that has survived history, because clearly there's something in those pages, in whatever it is in the medium, that is worthwhile of my attention. And so, yeah, I think it's a really cool thing that we can actually use the tools of a historian, which is fundamentally to look at what has survived, to help navigate our current life and say to ourselves, okay, I'm going to spend my time on what matters, not on all the floodgates of information that are arising every second, because every moment your attention is stolen from you. Just when you pick up your phone, you're either getting an advert or a BBC News alert or whatever, a notification. But yeah, Tangential point, but we digress. So I just wanted to move on now to some Oxbridge stuff because obviously people listening to this podcast will hopefully have an ambition to apply for history or humanities at Oxbridge. And I just wanted to ask a little bit about a week in the life of Noah, a week in the life of an ancient and modern historian. Could you walk through our listeners on what you do? What does your week look like?
Yeah, so it depends largely on how many courses I'm taking that term. So usually it kind of averages it out at about having 1.5 essays a week. And so thinking about that, for me, I'm someone that loves all the reading and probably spends not quite as much time as I should on the actual essay writing. But that'll mean that maybe let's just simplify it to a Monday to Sunday week. If I have one essay due on a Thursday and then have a few more days in the week left over, then I would do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I'd probably be in a library somewhere reading. I'm someone that loves kind of physical books, and I think Oxford's such a great place because it does actually have kind of every single physical book that exists in England. You can go to an interesting library and find it, and so I quite enjoy that. So I'll go to these libraries on my bike and then sit there all day, and I find that a lovely process. So I'll do that for the first kind of 3 days. Then the Thursday will be my planning and writing day, and then usually have a tutorial the next day. So in this case on the Friday, and so that's quite nice. And I usually use those days as kind of a reset day where I don't do any work other than the tutorial itself, just because otherwise I feel like it becomes a bit too much. And then kind of interwoven in all this is everything else that you want to do in your life, which can be difficult, but I find really rewarding. And I do rowing, and so each morning typically, or at least 4 times a week, there'll be a nice 6:30. You got to be on the water, so waking up at 5:30 to get there, kind of thing, and do that. And then Trinity, which is the college that I go to, has an incredible breakfast, so it's usually about sprinting back to try and get to there. And then I find it quite satisfying to then have kind of done sport, eaten, had a shower, be in a library by 9, kind of thing. And that for me is the way that I like to set out my day. And I think that's the main thing that you realise by going to Oxford, is that everyone has their own individual way that they like to set out their day. Some people, I mean, especially this last term, the weather was so good. There are some people who would refuse to do any work during the day, but would then spend from 8 p.m. until 2 a.m. in their rooms doing work. I think that sounds horrendous, and I couldn't possibly do that. Once I'm tired, that's it. I'm not doing any work. But it's very individual what ends up working for you. But yeah, I think people always do find their particular balance, and I find that it makes you kind of similar to, as you were saying about using kind of less social media, very intentional with your time, which I think is a very important skill for life in general. As you say, there is so much that is always trying to distract you. There are millions and billions of pounds spent on figuring out the most effective ways to take your attention. And so taking ownership of that and figuring out how you want to spend your time is such a vital skill. And so I think in some ways, although it's hectic, the kind of Oxford working week really lets you set that out for yourself.
Yeah, that point of intentionality is really spot on and quite interesting, because I think the one transition that I certainly noticed, having studied a humanities degree, is that during school, I wouldn't say you are completely independent. You have your structured lessons, you're taught everything in the lesson that you need to know for the exam. And pretty much, you can go home and do a bit of revision, but ultimately you're learning what you've just been taught. Whereas when you get to university, the independent thought that you need to engage with on a day-to-day basis is vastly different from A levels. And so I just wanted to ask a little bit on how have you found that transition from teacher-led learning to self-led learning at Oxford?
Yeah, well, it kind of it varies, as you said, depending on your subject, but especially for the humanities. I mean, so for chemistry, for example, they have kind of 2 lectures every single day, and then they'll have labs that take up 2 of their whole days, and then it kind of is you're carried along. But yeah, as you rightly pointed out, for the humanities, I mean, there have been terms where I haven't even had a lecture series that term because they kind of vary when they are. So there have been points where I have had 1.5 contact hours a week, and so the rest of the time is entirely yours, which can mean that sometimes if you're slightly less responsible than you should be, that it suddenly all disappears and you have run out of time somehow despite having so much available to you. But I think it's a really important skill to know how you want to spend your time and organising that. And so I think it's definitely a peculiar feeling to adapt to. And at the start, I think it's the main thing that people struggle with. And so sometimes it can be useful to kind of introduce to yourself an artificial structure. So some people will, kind of as I mentioned, being ready in the library at 9. For me, that doesn't really matter if it slips to 9:30 or whatever, or if I end up in a coffee shop instead of a library, whatever it is. But for some people, it will be, I will be in the library at 9, and I will leave the library at 5. And that's the structure that allows me to feel like my day is planned and kind of keep some of that organisation while adapting to this new feeling of being taught by yourself, essentially. I think my main takeaway, and kind of as I mentioned before, about the choice is to really lean into that. You can get very far in Oxford and in all of these topics that you end up doing by doing the particular subjects within it that you enjoy. Ultimately, the highest level that you could achieve will be highest in the subjects that you enjoy. It's in the same way that kind of personal statement and interview and things like that, you want them to talk about stuff that you like, because it will come across as actually being more interesting if you are more interested in it. Similarly, once you get there, one of the benefits of it not being teacher taught and not really having a syllabus per se is that you can take all of these fascinating topics in whatever direction you want. And so that's really the way that I've adapted to it and making the most of that freedom.
Yeah. I mean, freedom is wonderful for students who have just stepped out of that A-level sort of constricted environment where the syllabus is so rigid and forced upon you that you almost feel resentful in a way that you have to trudge through your A-levels and get through this syllabus that you might not particularly enjoy. But when you get to university, it's kind of like a fresh plane of grass. The pitch is open, it's there for you to run on and enjoy if you wish. So yeah, but at the same time, I'd imagine that with freedom comes a little bit of anxiety or dizziness because it can be a bit overwhelming. So have you ever had a moment where you've got a rogue essay on some ancient Greek rogue strand of political philosophy and thought, how do I go about this? What would your advice be to someone that might feel overwhelmed by the mass of history that's in front of them?
Yeah, it can be absolutely terrifying. I remember, I think the one that sticks out is this term actually just gone. I got an essay on what were the effects of the Black Death, and there was kind of no specificity to work with. I was kind of thinking, okay, how long term are we talking? Where are we talking? Factors do you want me to think about? Do you want me to talk about it kind of economically? Do you want me to talk about it demographically? There are so many possible routes to go down that I was a bit, speechless and unsure where to start. I think the first thing to do, and the first thing that I did in this situation, was reach out to tutorials are the name for the lessons, and you often have a partner that you work with in those tutorials. And so I asked her, what are you thinking about this? And she was like, I have no clue, I don't know where to start. And so then we both just approached our tutor and said, could we have something a bit more kind of directed so that we know where to look and what kind of things to look at? And then at the end of the day, all the tutors are really, really lovely people, and they're all there to support you. At the end of the day, they don't want to read a bad essay. They want you to be able to do as well as you can. purely for their own enjoyment. So he sent back a list of summative topic areas that we could kind of look into briefly and then figure out where we wanted to specify. So I think the number one thing is just, reach out to the people around you because they're all there to help.
Yeah, help is always an arm's reach away in Oxford and Cambridge. That's certainly something I remember from my time there. Now, on this topic of tutorials, having been at Oxford for 2 years now, I'm sure you've written, 1.5 essays times however many weeks you've been there. What do you think the tutors are looking for? And I want to ask you if you can really interpolate that back to what the tutors are looking for in a candidate. Because I think, and this is something that I've been talking about, in my course and on the podcast in general, is that I think a tutorial fundamentally is a proxy for an interview, or an interview is a proxy for a tutorial. They're exactly the same thing. And so if you can do well in a tutorial, you can then by default do well in an interview. So what would you say they're looking for?
Yeah, I think for me, I've always found that it's just someone that is genuinely interested in discussing the topics that are present and has the ability or confidence to present those ideas. They're not asking you to kind of come up with something entirely groundbreaking and something that they've never heard before, because ultimately most of them have read every single possible thing on the topics that we're talking about. You can't kind of get around their knowledge, but what they want you to do is they want you to present what they know very well in an interesting way that gets them to think. And as I've kind of mentioned before, I think that has to stem from you properly enjoying it. So I think kind of looking more at the interview, it's about not just knowing a lot about the subjects that you want to talk about, but that's kind of a necessary result of being interested in those subjects. You will just read lots and you will be very aware of particular ideas. And bringing that kind of fresh perspective, right? They don't want to sit there and hear something that they've heard trotted out a million times, just reciting a book that they've kind of definitely read. But instead, they want to hear what you think. And I think that was, for me, a very comforting realization. I had a tutor actually in my first term she's really, really lovely, and she kind of almost told me that she was kind of like, your essay was a bit too much of a summary of previous works. That's not really the point of being here, right? You're given so much freedom, you're given so much choice because they want you to use that freedom. In the same way that in the interview, you shouldn't feel scared or feel that you want to rely on, as I said, kind of a previous work that you've read and trotting that out, but instead just, as much as it's much easier to say than do, just be brave and present your ideas, because ultimately that's what they care about and that's why you're there, rather than anyone else. Anyone could read that book, but only you can present your ideas.
Yeah. So it sounds like, originality, fresh thinking, critical thinking, those are the sort of traits that tutors look for. As you said, they're not looking for you to reinvent the wheel. They're not looking for, the next historian of the future to come in and discuss their perspective on World War II. It's more, can you bring a layer of nuance to an argument? Can you think of one thing that maybe the historians aren't looking at, or maybe the tutors haven't thought about? And I think if you can do that and display a genuine, authentic interest in the subject, the tutors will like that, and they'll see that you have potential to do well at Oxford and Cambridge. So thanks for that point. I've just got one question to finish up on, and this sort of ties into our theme earlier, where I asked you around what is the point in studying history? Why should we bother to look at it in the first place? And I wanted to ask you, if you were to cast your mind back at your own personal history when you were applying to Oxford for your subject, would you do anything differently? And by extension, if any 17, 18-year-old is watching this and they are also applying for Oxbridge, whether it's humanities or STEM, what advice would you give them based on the lessons you've learned from your own past about the process? And it can be one piece of advice. It doesn't have to be, anything earth-shattering.
Groundbreaking again, thinking back. Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting question. I think it would have been to yeah to kind of enjoy it more. Ultimately, I think it's a very difficult process and it's very challenging, and you don't really know where it's going to go. And so, being exclusively focused on the result, I think, kind of can be quite a tempting thing to fall into. Ultimately, you are doing an application, so the result's going to have a bearing on the way you feel about it. But also, the process is one of the most enjoyable parts, or at least I found, of A level. Being able to kind of look at all these different areas in my own time and figure out which bits I found interesting and which bits I wanted to learn more about was one of the best bits of history for me in that time. And so I think kind of being more driven by the process than the results would be my advice for it, and figuring out what you can do to enjoy that process, because I think the results come if you do that, but if you focus on the results you don't necessarily enjoy the process. So I think that's the better way of doing it, and that's what I would tell my younger self if I had the chance.
Fantastic. Focus on the process and the results will follow. It's a great way to finish up. Noah, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. Best of luck with next year and speak soon.
Thank you very much.